Did you know a failed super glue led to those little yellow squares you stick everywhere? Or that a melted chocolate bar in a scientist's pocket revealed a cooking revolution that zaps your leftovers in minutes? And get this, a life-saving heart device was born because an engineer grabbed the wrong tiny part, accidentally creating a rhythmic pulse instead of a steady recording. These aren't plot twists from a movie. They're the real stories behind some of the things we can't imagine living without. Get ready to have your mind blown by inventions that happened completely by mistake. Number 15. The sticky note that wasn't supposed to stick. Once upon a time, in 1968, a scientist named Dr. Spencer was working for a big company called 3M. His job was to create a super-duper strong adhesive. Imagine a glue so powerful it could hold almost anything together permanently. He mixed chemicals, he ran tests, he hoped for a breakthrough, but one of his experiments went a bit sideways. Instead of the super strong glue he was aiming for, he cooked up something entirely different. It was an adhesive, yes, but it was what scientists call low tack. This meant it was only slightly sticky. You could press something with this glue onto a surface and then peel it right off without leaving a mark or any sticky gunk. And the really neat part, you could stick it down again somewhere else and it would still hold. The secret was in tiny tough acrylic spheres in the adhesive that only made contact at their edges, allowing for this gentle stickiness and repositioning. Dr. Silver thought his creation was interesting, but he couldn't quite figure out what to do with it. He famously called it a solution looking for a problem. He showed it to his colleagues at 3M, hoping someone would have a brilliant idea, but for 5 long years, this peculiar not-so-sticky glue sat on the shelf, a scientific curiosity without a clear purpose. Then along came Art Fry, another scientist at 3M, who had a rather common everyday annoyance. Art sang in his church choir, and he used little slips of paper to mark the pages in his hymn book. Problem was, these makeshift bookmarks kept falling out, which was quite frustrating when trying to find the right hymn at the right time. One Sunday, it's said that while he was at church, it struck him he remembered Dr. Silver's odd, weak adhesive. What if he applied a little bit of that mistake glue to his paper bookmarks? They would stick to the pages, holding his place, but he could easily lift them off without tearing the delicate paper of his hymnal. He got a sample of Silver's adhesive, coated some paper, and it was a perfect match. The bookmarks stayed put and peeled off cleanly. Art started making these for himself and then began sharing them with people in the office. Initially, the bigwigs at 3M weren't entirely sold on the idea. They launched a product called Press and Peel in 4 cities in 1977. But the sales weren't spectacular. It seemed people didn't quite understand what it was for just by looking at it. The company almost gave up on the whole thing. But then, they decided to try a bold marketing move in Boise, Idaho, known as the Boys Blitz. They basically carpet-bombed offices in the city with free samples. Once people actually got their hands on these little sticky papers and tried them, they were smitten. They found countless uses for them. By 1980, these notes, now famously known as Post-it notes, were launched across the United States. That iconic canary yellow color. That was also a bit of an accident. The lab next door to the Post-it team happened to have scrap yellow paper on hand when they first started making pads for internal distribution. Soon, these little squares of mildly sticky paper became an indispensable tool in offices, homes, and schools worldwide. Number 14. From grimy walls to colorful creations. In the 1930s, before homes were commonly heated with oil or gas, many people used coal-burning furnaces. These furnaces were great for warmth, But they had a dirty little secret. They left a sooty, grimy residue on wallpaper. Cleaning this soot off was a real pain. Enter Cleo McVicker, who worked for his family's soap company. Kuto Products. Kuto was struggling, and they needed a new product to save the business. Noah McVicker, Cleo's brother, developed a putty-like substance designed specifically to clean wallpaper. It was a pliable, non-toxic dough that people could roll across their wallpaper to lift off the soot and grime. It worked. For a while, this wallpaper cleaner was a decent seller for Kuto. Fast forward to the post-World War II era, the 1950s. Times were changing. More and more homes were switching to cleaner heating methods like oil and natural gas. Plus, new types of washable Kymo wallpaper were becoming popular. Suddenly, the need for a doughy wallpaper cleaner started to dwindle, and Kuto Products found itself in trouble once again. The company was on the brink of collapse. But then, a stroke of luck came from an unexpected place. Cleo McVicker's sister-in-law, Kay Zufall, was a nursery school teacher. She had read an article about how kids were using the wallpaper cleaner for arts and crafts projects, like making holiday ornaments. It was non-toxic, easy to mold, and didn't make a huge mess. Kay thought this was a brilliant idea. She suggested to Joe McVicker, Cleo's nephew, who had taken over the business, that they should reposi the wallpaper cleaner as a children's toy. She even came up with a new name for it: Play-Doh. Joe was initially hesitant, but with the company struggling, he decided to give it a shot. They removed the detergents from the compound to make it even safer for kids and added bright colors and a pleasant almond scent. In 1956, Play-Doh was demonstrated at a major toy convention and then introduced to the toy department of Woodward and Lothrop, a prominent department store in Washington, D.C. It was an instant hit. Captain Kangaroo, a popular children's television host, began featuring Play-Doh on his show in 1957, and sales skyrocketed. What was once a humble beiged wallpaper cleaner, designed to wipe away dirt, transformed into one of the most iconic and beloved creative toys for children found in playrooms and classrooms across the globe. Millions of pounds of Play-Doh are still squished, rolled, and sculpted by little hands every year. Number 13, the toy that tripped its way into fame. Back in the early 1940s, during World War II, an American naval mechanical engineer named Richard T. James was stationed at the Cramp shipbuilding yards in Philadelphia. He was working on developing special springs called torsion springs that could be used to stabilize sensitive instruments on ships, keeping them steady even when the seas were rough and the vessel was rocking and rolling. His goal was entirely practical, aimed at improving naval equipment during a critical time. One day in 1943, while he was working with these tension springs, one of them accidentally got knocked off a shelf or a table. Instead of just clattering to the floor in a heap, the spring did something rather mesmerizing. It appeared to walk or step down from where it fell, flipping end over end in a series of graceful arcs, moving across a stack of books, then onto the tabletop, and finally onto the floor, where it coiled up neatly. Richard was captivated by the way it moved. It wasn't what he was trying to achieve for the Navy, but it was certainly interesting. He took the spring home to show his wife, Betty. She immediately saw its potential as a toy. She was the one who thumbed through a dictionary and came up with the name, thinking the Swedish word meant sleek or sinuous, which perfectly described the spring's fluid motion. Richard spent the next 2 years experimenting with different types of steel wire and coil dimensions to find the perfect combination that would allow the toy to walk downstairs and perform its characteristic movements. He finally settled on a flat-edged, high-carbon steel wire. To get their new toy business off the ground, Richard and Betty James took out a $500 loan. They had 400 Slinkies manufactured and tried to sell them to toy stores, but initially they had little luck. Store owners were skeptical. The big break came during the Christmas shopping season of 1945. The Gimbel's department store in Philadelphia agreed to let them demonstrate the Slinky. Richard set up a simple ramp. Within 90 minutes of the demonstration starting, they had sold all 400 Slinkies. The toy was a sensation. Its ability to seemingly defy gravity as it gracefully tumbled downstairs captured the imagination of children and adults alike. Though Richard James later left the company and his family, Betty James took over, moved the company to Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania, and oversaw its continued success for decades, making the Slinky a classic toy beloved by generations. It wasn't a life-saving device or a kitchen staple, but this accidental spring became a source of simple joy and fascination for millions. Number 12. The candy bar that cooked up a kitchen revolution. Percy Spencer was a self-taught engineer working for the Raytheon Corporation during World War II. He was a genuine electronics whiz, holding over 300 patents by the end of his career. In 1945, he was working on a project involving magnetrons, which are high-powered vacuum tubes that generate microwaves, the kind of microwaves used in radar systems. Radar was a crucial technology during the war, used to detect enemy aircraft and ships. Spencer was one of the leading experts in radar tube design. One day, while testing a new active magnetron, Spencer was standing in front of it when he noticed something peculiar. He had a Mr. Goodbar candy bar in his pocket, and it had melted. This was strange because the lab wasn't particularly warm. Spencer wasn't one to ignore a curious event. He was intrigued. He suspected the microwaves from the magnetron were responsible. So, he decided to experiment. The next thing he tried was popcorn. He placed some kernels near the magnetron tube, and to the astonishment of his colleagues, the popcorn started to pop, scattering all over the lab. The day after, he tried an egg. He placed it in a kettle with an opening cut in the side and aimed the magnetron at the opening. Curious colleague, wanting a closer look, peered into the kettle just as the egg exploded, splattering hot yolk on his face. Spencer realized he was onto something big. These microwaves could cook food, and fast. Raytheon, his employer, quickly saw the potential. In 1947, they released the first commercial microwave oven. It was called the Radarange. However, this first model was a beast. It was nearly 6 feet tall, weighed over 750 pounds, and cost about $5,000. That's like $60,000 in today's money. It also needed to be water-cooled. Because of its size and expense, it was primarily used in restaurants, railway cars, and ocean liners, places that needed to heat food quickly for many people. It took many years for microwave ovens to become a common household appliance. Engineers worked to make them smaller, safer, and more affordable. By the late 1960s, countertop models started to appear, and by the 1970s and 1980s, their popularity exploded. What started with a melted candy bar in a radar scientist's pocket led to a device that revolutionized home cooking, reheating leftovers and making quick meals, saving countless hours in kitchens around the world. Percy Spencer, by the way, only received a one-time $2 gratuity from Raytheon for his world-changing discovery, the company's standard practice for all inventor employees at the time. Number 11. The non-stick wonder born from a failed fridge. In the late 1930s, scientists at Kinetic Chemicals, a company jointly owned by DuPont and General Motors, were on a mission. They were trying to create a new, better, safer refrigerant. The refrigerants used at the time, like ammonia and sulfur dioxide, were toxic and corrosive. The goal was to find a non-toxic, non-flammable alternative for refrigerators and air conditioners. Dr. Roy J. Plunkett, a young chemist at DuPont's Jackson Laboratory in New Jersey, was part of this effort. On April 6, 1938, Plunkett was working with a gas called tetrafluoroethylene, or TFE. He had stored a cylinder of TFE gas, which he had cooled and pressurized, intending to use it to synthesize a new refrigerant. When he and his assistant, Jack Ribach, opened the valve on the cylinder that morning, nothing came out. This was odd, because the cylinder's weight showed it was still full of gas. Plunkett was puzzled. Had the valve malfunctioned? He poked a wire into the valve. Still nothing. Frustrated, and also a bit curious as to what had happened to his precious gas, Plunkett decided to cut the cylinder open. Inside, he didn't find gas. Instead, he found a strange, waxy white powder. TFE gas had polymerized. Its molecules had spontaneously joined together to form a solid. This new substance was incredibly slippery. Almost nothing would stick to it. It was also resistant to practically every chemical solvent, acid and base. It could withstand extreme temperatures, both hot and cold, and it was an excellent electrical insulator. Plunkett knew this wasn't the refrigerant he was looking for, but he also knew that a material with such unique properties had to be useful for something. DuPont patented the substance, polytetrafluoroethylene, PTFE, in 1941 and trademarked it as Teflon in 1945. Its first major use was highly secretive and critical. It was used in the Manhattan Project during World War II to make gaskets and seals that were resistant to the highly corrosive uranium hexafluoride gas used in producing enriched uranium for the atomic bomb. After the war, DuPont looked for other applications. For a while, Teflon was mostly used in industrial settings. The idea of using it for non-stick cookware came later. A French engineer named Marc Gregoire learned about Teflon in the early 1950s. His wife, Colette, suggested he try using it to coat her cooking pans to make them non-stick. He developed a process to bond Teflon to aluminum, and in 1954 he patented it. He founded the Tefl Company in 1956, and Happy Pans, as they were called, started to sell. The first Teflon-coated frying pan was introduced in the United States in 1960 under the name the Happy Pan. It took a while to catch on, but eventually Teflon pans became a kitchen fixture, saving cooks from the frustration of stuck-on food and making cleanup much easier, all from a gas cylinder that refused to hiss. Number 10. Nature's nuisance that fastened our world. Sometimes, inspiration strikes in the most ordinary or even annoying circumstances. This was certainly the case for Swiss engineer George de Mestral in 1941. He had gone for a walk in the woods with his Irish pointer dog. When they returned, both he and his dog were covered in burrs, those pesky little seed pods from the burdock plant that cling stubbornly to fabric and fur. As de Mestral painstakingly picked the burrs off his trousers and his dog's coat, he became curious. Instead of just being irritated, he wondered how they stuck so effectively. Being an engineer and an inventor by nature, he decided to examine one of the burrs under a microscope. What he saw was fascinating. The burr was covered in hundreds of tiny hooks. These hooks would catch onto anything with a loop, like the fibers in clothing or the hairs of an animal's fur. This simple, natural mechanism was incredibly effective at holding the burr in place, allowing it to travel with its host and spread its seeds. de Mestral had an idea. Could he retucate this hook and loop system artificially to create a new kind of fastener? Took him nearly a decade of experimentation to turn his idea into a reality. Replicating nature's design proved to be quite challenging. He initially tried using cotton for the hook side, but it wore out too quickly. He needed a material that was strong and durable. After much trial and error, he discovered that nylon, when sewn under infrared light, formed tough little hooks that were perfect for his fastener. For the loop side, he created a fuzzy nylon fabric with lots of tiny resilient loops. When pressed together, the hooks would catch in the loops, creating a secure but easily separable bond. He patented his invention in 1955 and named it Velcro, a combination of the French words velours, meaning velvet for the loopy side, and crochet, meaning hook. At first, the fashion industry was slow to adopt Velcro. It looked a bit clunky and was associated more with utilitarian gear than high fashion. However, the aerospace industry saw its potential. NASA astronauts used Velcro to secure objects in zero gravity during the Apollo missions. This high-profile use helped to popularize the fastener. Slowly but surely, Velcro found its way into all sorts of products. Children's shoes, making it easier for kids to fasten their own footwear, medical braces, blood pressure, cuffs, sporting equipment, clothing, cable ties, and countless other applications. That annoying burr that clung to George de Mestral's pants led to a fastening system that is now used all over the world, making life a little bit easier, one satisfying rip at a time. Number 9. The instant bond meant for a clearer shot. Dr. Harry Coover was a chemist working for Eastman Kodak, a company famous for its cameras and film. In 1942, during the height of World War II, Coover and his team were trying to develop clear plastic gun sights for Allied soldiers. They were experimenting with a class of chemicals called cyanoacrylates. One particular formulation they tried, methyl cyanoacrylate, proved to be a real problem. It was incredibly sticky. It bonded to absolutely everything it touched, instantly and stubbornly. It stuck to their fingers, to their lab equipment, to any two surfaces it came between. For the purpose of creating clear optical quality plastic for gun sights, this super stickiness was a complete failure. It was frustrating, annoying, and the material was quickly rejected and set aside. Fast forward 9 years to 1951. Dr. Coover was now supervising a different project at Kodak's research labs in Tennessee. This time, his team was trying to develop heat-resistant acrylic polymers for jet airplane canopies. Fred Wenzel, one of the chemists on Coover's team, was testing various cyanoacrylate compounds again, specifically ethyl cyanoacrylate. Wenzel spread a film of this compound between two expensive glass prisms and a refractometer to measure its refractive index. When he tried to separate the prisms to clean them, he found they were permanently bonded together. Prisms were ruined. This time, instead of just being frustrated, Dr. Coover had a light bulb moment. He remembered the annoying stickiness from 9 years earlier. He realized that this incredible ability to bond almost anything to anything else, instantly and without needing heat or pressure, wasn't a flaw. It was a unique and powerful property. This failed material could be an entirely new type of adhesive. Kodak began to develop it as a commercial product. In 1958, Eastman Pound 910, later known as super glue, was introduced to the market. It was demonstrated on the popular TV show I've Got a Secret, where Coover himself lifted the host Gary Moore off the ground using just 1 drop of the adhesive bonding 2 steel cylinders. Public was amazed. Super glue became a household name, famous for its ability to create strong, rapid bonds on a huge variety of materials like metal, plastic, rubber, ceramic, and wood. It found uses in industry, in medicine. Cyanocrylates were used as a tissue adhesive in the Vietnam War to quickly close soldiers' wounds on the battlefield, and, of course, in homes everywhere for quick repairs of broken items. All because a substance was too sticky for its original job. Number 8. The shatterproof shield from a clumsy chemist's drop. In the early 1900s, glass was just glass. If it broke, it shattered into sharp, dangerous shards. This was a particular problem for the newfangled automobiles, where a flying stone or a minor accident could send splinters of glass flying into the faces of drivers and passengers. Many people were looking for a solution, but it arrived quite by chance. Edouard Benedictus was a French chemist, artist, and writer. In 1903, he was working in his lab when he accidentally knocked a glass flask off a shelf. He heard it hit the floor and braced himself for the sound of shattering glass and the tedious cleanup of sharp pieces. To his surprise, while the flask was cracked all over, it hadn't shattered into fragments. It had largely kept its shape. Benedictus was intrigued. He picked it up and examined it. He remembered that the flask had recently contained a solution of cellulose nitrate, a type of liquid plastic. The solvent had evaporated, leaving a thin, invisible film of plastic coating the inside of the flask. This plastic film had held the broken pieces of glass together. Benedictus made a mental note of this interesting phenomenon but didn't immediately see a practical application for it. He was busy with other work. However, a few weeks later, he read a newspaper story about a recent surge in car accidents where people were severely injured by flying shards of broken windshield glass. The story mentioned a young woman who had been horrifically disfigured. This resonated with Benedictus. He remembered his dropped flask and the way the plastic film had prevented it from shattering. He realized that this principle could be used to make glass safer. He immediately went back to his lab and began experimenting. He tried sandwiching a layer of celluloid, an early plastic, between two pieces of glass, and then pressing them together. It worked. The resulting laminated glass would crack if struck hard, but the pieces would stick to the plastic interlayer instead of flying apart. He patented his invention in 1909, calling it triplex. Initially, car manufacturers were hesitant to adopt safety glass because it was more expensive than regular glass. Henry Ford was one of the early adopters, offering it as an option and then making it standard on his Ford Model A cars in the late 1920s. The real push for its widespread use came from its adoption for gas mask lenses during World War I, proving its protective qualities under extreme conditions. Gradually, laws were passed requiring safety glass in automobile windshields, and eventually in all car windows. Today, laminated safety glass is used not only in cars but also in buildings, for windows in high-risk areas, skylights and glass floors, and many other applications where shattered glass could pose a danger. All thanks to a clumsy moment and a keen observation. Number 7. The stale breakfast that became a morning staple. The story of cornflakes begins not with a desire to create a new breakfast food, but with a quest for health and dietary reform in the late 19th century. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg was a physician and the superintendent of the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan, a world-renowned health resort that emphasized vegetarianism, exercise, and hydrotherapy. He and his younger brother, Will Keith Kellogg, W.K. Kellogg, who worked as the bookkeeper and business manager at the sanitarium, were constantly experimenting with foods for their patients, trying to create easily digestible, bland, and healthy options, particularly ones that would discourage certain vices. They were particularly interested in developing a bread-like product made from grains that was easy on the stomach. In 1894, some accounts say 1898, the exact year is a bit debated in historical anecdotes, the Kellogg brothers were experimenting with boiled wheat. They were trying to make a type of dough by forcing cooked wheat through rollers. One day, they were called away on some urgent sanitarium business, and a batch of boiled wheat was accidentally left sitting out for an extended period, possibly overnight, or even for a couple of days. When they returned, the wheat had gone stale and a bit moldy. Most people would have thrown it out, but the Kellogg's were on a tight budget. They decided to try running the stale, overcooked wheat through the rollers anyway, just to see what would happen. To their surprise, instead of coming out as a sheet of dough, each wheat berry flattened into a thin, individual flake. Intrigued, they baked these flakes. The result was a light, crispy, and surprisingly tasty product. They served these wheat flakes to the sanitarium patients, who loved them. W.K. Kellogg, being the more business-minded of the two brothers, saw the commercial potential in these accidental flakes. He persuaded his brother to try making flakes from other grains, including corn, which proved to be even more popular. W.K. wanted to add sugar to the corn flakes to make them more palatable to a wider audience. But Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, a staunch health advocate, was strongly opposed to adding sugar. This disagreement eventually led to a rift between the brothers. W.K. Kellogg eventually bought the rights to the cornflake recipe from his brother and in 1906 founded the Battle Creek Toasted Corn Flake Company, which later became the Kellogg Company. He decided to add sugar to his cornflakes and marketed them aggressively. They became a massive commercial success, fundamentally changing breakfast habits. It started as a batch of forgotten stale wheat transformed into a global breakfast phenomenon, launching an entire industry of ready-to-eat breakfast cereals. Number 6. The crispy comeback cooked up in annoyance. The invention of the potato chip, one of the world's most popular snack foods, is often attributed to a chef's moment of pique in 1853. George Crumb, whose birth name was George Speck, was a cook of Native American and African American heritage, working at Moon's Lake House, a resort in Saratoga Springs, New York. Saratoga Springs was a fashionable summer destination for wealthy city dwellers. The story goes that one day a particularly fussy patron, sometimes identified in lore, though unconfirmed as railroad magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt, kept sending his order of French fried potatoes back to the kitchen, complaining that they were too thick, too soggy, and not salty enough. Crumb, known for his culinary skills, but also for a somewhat irritable temperament, became increasingly frustrated with the customer's repeated complaints. After several attempts to satisfy the diner, Crumb decided he'd had enough. In a fit of sarcastic spite, he resolved to make potatoes so thin and crispy that the customer wouldn't be able to eat them with a fork. He sliced the potatoes paper thin, fried them in hot oil until they were golden brown and brittle, and then, as an extra touch of defiance, he sprinkled them with an excessive amount of salt. He sent these chips out to the diner, expecting them to be rejected once more. To Crumb's surprise, the customer absolutely loved them. The super thin, ultra-crispy, salty potatoes were a hit. Other patrons at Moon's Lake House soon started requesting Saratoga chips, as they came to be known. They quickly became a specialty of the house. Crumb eventually opened his own restaurant in Saratoga Springs in 1860, called Crumb's House, where he featured baskets of his signature potato chips on every table. For a long time, potato chips were primarily a restaurant food served fresh. They were difficult to package and transport without crushing or going stale. The widespread availability of potato chips as a packaged snack food didn't happen until the 1920s, with the invention of the mechanical potato peeler, and later, in 1926, when Laura Scudder started packaging chips in wax paper bags which helped to keep them fresh and crisp longer. This allowed potato chips to be sold in grocery stores and enjoyed far beyond the confines of restaurants. What began as a chef's annoyed retort to a picky customer accidentally created an international snacking sensation. Number 5. The sweet surprise on a coal tar chemist's fingers. In 1879, a chemist named Konstantin Fahlberg was working in the laboratory of Professor Ira Remsen at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Fahlberg wasn't trying to invent a new food product. His research was focused on coal tar derivatives. Coal tar, a thick, dark liquid byproduct of producing coke and coal gas from coal, was a source of many interesting organic compounds, and chemists were busy exploring its potential. One evening, after a long day in the lab working with various chemicals derived from coal tar, Fahlberg went home for dinner. As he was eating a piece of bread, he noticed that it tasted unusually sweet. He asked his wife if she had put something sweet on the bread, but she hadn't. He then realized that his fingers also tasted intensely sweet. He traced the sweetness back to his own hands. He hadn't washed them thoroughly after leaving the lab that day. Curious, he rushed back to his workbench and started tasting, a practice highly discouraged in modern chemistry labs for safety reasons, the various chemicals he had been working with. He eventually identified the source of the sweetness, a compound he had synthesized called osulfobenzimide. He had spilled some of it on his hands without noticing. This compound was hundreds of times sweeter than sugar, but it had no calories. Fahlberg and Remsen jointly published their discovery of this new sweet substance in 1879. Fahlberg named it saccharin. Fahlberg, seeing the commercial potential of a non-caloric sweetener, patented saccharin in 1884 and began mass production without Professor Remsen, which caused considerable friction between the two scientists. Remsen felt that Fahlberg had taken sole credit for a discovery made in his lab. Saccharin quickly gained popularity, especially during times of sugar scarcity, such as World War I. It was also marketed to people with diabetes who needed to control their sugar intake. Despite some health controversies over the years, most of which have since been reevaluated, saccharin was once thought to be a carcinogen based on studies in rats, but later research showed this wasn't applicable to humans, and it was removed from lists of potential carcinogens. Saccharin became the first commercially available artificial sweetener. It paved the way for a whole industry of sugar substitutes, all because a chemist forgot to wash his hands before dinner and had an unusually sweet roll. Number 4. The kitchen mishap that bounced into our lives. Natural rubber, derived from the sap of rubber trees, had been known for centuries, but it had significant drawbacks. In its raw form, it was sticky and gooey when hot, and brittle and stiff when cold. It wasn't very durable and would often rot. This limited its usefulness. Many inventors and entrepreneurs in the early 19th century were trying to find a way to make rubber more stable and versatile. Charles Goodyear, a struggling hardware merchant from Connecticut, was one of them. He became obsessed with finding a way to cure rubber. Goodyear spent years, from the 1830s onwards, in a desperate and often impoverished quest. He experimented relentlessly, mixing raw rubber with all sorts of substances: salt, pepper, ink, witch hazel, nitric acid, anything he could think of. He faced ridicule, debt, and even jail time for unpaid bills, but he persisted. His family suffered greatly, but he was driven by the belief that he could solve the rubber problem. He even used his wife's kitchen for his smelly experiments. The exact moment of his breakthrough discovery, likely around 1839, is shrouded in a bit of fireside tale legend, but the most common story involves an accident. Goodyear was said to be demonstrating one of his latest rubber mixtures, this one containing sulfur, to some people in a general store in Woburn, Massachusetts. In his excitement, a piece of the rubber sulfur mixture either accidentally flew out of his hand and landed on a hot potbelly stove, or he deliberately threw it onto the stove in frustration after yet another failed experiment. Instead of melting into a sticky mess, as natural rubber usually did when heated, the piece charred like leather. When Goodyear examined the charred lump, he found that the edges that hadn't been completely burned were dry, springy, and permanently elastic. The heat hadn't destroyed it. It had transformed it into a new kind of rubber. He realized that heating rubber mixed with sulfur was the key. He spent several more years perfecting the process, which he called vulcanization, after Vulcan, the Roman god of fire and forge. This process involved heating rubber with sulfur under pressure, which cross-linked the polymer chains in the rubber, making it strong, elastic, waterproof, and resistant to both heat and cold. Goodyear patented his process in 1844. Vulcanized rubber revolutionized countless industries. It was used to make waterproof boots and clothing tires for bicycles and then automobiles, a development spearheaded by others like John Boyd, Dunlop, and the Michelin brothers. Hoses, gaskets, seals, conveyor belts, medical equipment, and so much more. Charles Goodyear himself, despite his groundbreaking invention, didn't achieve great financial success from it, and died in debt in 1860. However, his accidental discovery on a hot stove transformed rubber from a problematic natural curiosity into one of the most essential materials of the industrial age, fundamentally shaping the modern world. The Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, founded in 1898, was named in his honor. Number 3. The mysterious glow that saw right through us. In the late 19th century, physicists were fascinated by cathode rays, streams of electrons produced in vacuum tubes. Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen, a German physics professor at the University of Würzburg, was one of these researchers. On the evening of November 8, 1895, Röntgen was experimenting in his darkened laboratory with a Crookes tube, a type of vacuum tube through which an electrical current was passed. He had covered the tube with black cardboard to block out any visible light that might be produced by the glowing gas inside. Nearby, on a bench a few feet away from the covered Crookes tube, was a small screen coated with barium platinocyanide, a fluorescent material. To Röntgen's surprise, when he passed an electrical current through the Crookes tube, he noticed that this fluorescent screen began to glow faintly. This was bizarre. The tube was completely covered, so no visible light could be escaping to make the screen fluoresce. He turned the current off, and the glow stopped. He turned it on again, and the screen glowed again. Röntgen realized he had stumbled upon some new kind of invisible ray, one that could pass through the black cardboard. He was mystified and excited. He began to investigate the properties of these unknown rays. He found they could pass through many objects that were opaque to visible light, like paper, wood, and thin sheets of metal. He discovered that denser materials blocked the rays more effectively. Most astonishingly, when he held his hand between the Crookes tube and the fluorescent screen, he could see the darker shadow of his bones outlined within the fainter shadow of his hand. He didn't know what these rays were, so he temporarily called them X-rays, with X representing the unknown. He worked intensely in secret for several weeks, eating and sleeping in his lab, to understand this phenomenon. He even made the first X-ray photograph, an image of his wife, Anna Bertha's hand, showing her bones and her wedding ring. When she saw the ghostly image, she reportedly exclaimed, "I have seen my death." On December 28, 1895, Röntgen submitted his first paper on a new kind of rays to the Würzburg Physical Medical Society. News of his discovery spread like wildfire around the world. The medical implications were immediately obvious. For the first time, doctors could look inside the human body without surgery. X-rays revolutionized medical diagnosis, allowing for the detection of broken bones, foreign objects, and diseases like tuberculosis. Röntgen was awarded the first ever Nobel Prize in Physics in 1901 for his discovery. This accidental observation of a faint glow in a darkened lab opened up a new window into the invisible world and profoundly changed medicine forever. Number 2. The wrong part that got hearts beating right. In the 1950s, Wilson Great Batch was an electrical engineer and assistant professor at the University of Buffalo. He was working on building an oscillator, a device that produces a rhythmic electrical signal. His specific project at the time was to create a device that could record heart sounds, particularly fast heartbeats. He was hoping his invention would help researchers at the Chronic Disease Research Institute in Buffalo. One day in 1956, Great Batch was assembling one of these heart sound recording devices in his workshop, which was a barn behind his house. He reached into a box for a resistor, a small electronic component that he needed for the circuit. He was supposed to grab a 10,000 ohm resistor. However, he accidentally picked up the wrong one. He mistakenly pulled out a 1 megohm resistor from the box. This resistor was 100 times more powerful than the one he intended to use. He soldered it into the circuit without realizing his mistake. When he turned the device on, he expected it to produce a steady tone or signal that he could use for his recordings. Instead, the circuit started to produce a distinct, rhythmic electrical pulse. Squish, 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 as he later described it. Pulse lasted for 1.8 milliseconds, followed by a 1-second interval of inactivity, then another 1.8 millisecond pulse. Great Batch stared at the oscilloscope, displaying the waveform. That rhythmic pulsing sounded familiar. It sounded like a human heartbeat. He immediately recognized the significance of his mistake. Instead of a device to record heartbeats, he had accidentally created a device that could simulate a heartbeat. He realized that such a device, if made small enough and reliable enough, could be used to help hearts that weren't beating correctly. At the time, existing pacemakers were large external machines that plugged into wall sockets, were often painful for patients, and were only used temporarily in emergencies. The idea of a small, implantable device was revolutionary. Great Batch spent the next 2 years refining his invention, making it smaller and encasing it in epoxy resin to protect it from body fluids. He collaborated with surgeons Dr. William Chardak and Dr. Andrew Gage. In 1958, they successfully tested an early version of the implantable pacemaker in a dog. Then, in 1960, the first Great Batch designed implantable pacemaker was successfully implanted into a 77-year-old human patient who went on to live for another 18 months with the device. Wilson Great Batch's accidental use of the wrong resistor led to the development of the first practical and reliable implantable cardiac pacemaker. His invention has since saved and improved the lives of millions of people around the world suffering from heart rhythm disorders. He went on to hold over 325 patents, but the pacemaker, born from a simple component mix-up in a barn, remains his most hail legacy. Number 1. The moldy mistake that conquered killer bugs. Before the 1940s, even a small scratch could be deadly. Bacterial infections like pneumonia, gonorrhea, rheumatic fever, and staphylococcus infections were major killers. Doctors had few effective treatments against them. This all began to change thanks to a notoriously untidy Scottish bacteriologist named Dr. Alexander Fleming. In September 1928, Fleming returned to his laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital in London after a month-long vacation. Before leaving, he had left several Petri dishes containing colonies of Staphylococcus bacteria, which can cause boils, sore throats, and abscesses, on a bench in a corner of his lab. Fleming was known for his cluttered and sometimes messy workspace. Upon his return, he began to sort through the stack of old Petri dishes, examining them before sterilizing and reusing them. On one of the dishes, he noticed something unusual. It had been contaminated with a blue-green mold, a species of penicillium. This wasn't entirely surprising, as mold spores are common in the air. But what caught Fleming's sharp eye was that in the area immediately surrounding the mold, the colonies of Staphylococcus bacteria had been destroyed. Further away from the mold, the bacteria were still growing normally. It looked like the mold was producing some substance that was killing the bacteria. Fleming was intrigued. He took a sample of the mold and began to cultivate. He found that it produced a mold juice that was remarkably effective at killing a wide range of harmful bacteria, even when diluted many times. Importantly, this substance seemed to be non-toxic to animal cells. He identified the mold as Penicillium notatum, later corrected to Penicillium rubens, and in 1929 he published his findings, calling the active antibacterial substance penicillin. However, Fleming faced challenges in isolating and purifying penicillin in large quantities. He was a bacteriologist, not a chemist, and the substance proved to be very unstable. For over a decade, penicillin remained largely a laboratory curiosity, its full therapeutic potential unrealized. Fleming himself moved on to other research, though he continued to use crude penicillin extracts for some local treatments. It wasn't until World War II, when the need for treatments for infected wounds became urgent, that a team of scientists at Oxford University, led by Howard Florey, Ernst Chain, and Norman Heatley, took up Fleming's research. They developed methods to purify penicillin and demonstrate its incredible life-saving power in treating bacterial infections in animals and then humans. Large-scale production was then pioneered in the United States. Penicillin became a wonder drug, saving countless lives during the war and revolutionizing medicine in the decades that followed. It heralded the age of antibiotics and transformed the fight against infectious diseases. All because a stray mold spore landed on a forgotten Petri dish in a messy lab, and a keen-eyed scientist noticed something out of the ordinary. Fleming, Florey, and Chain shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1945 for their work.